I'm Marianne Grady Flores. We have members of the Ithaca Catholic Worker and other people from Ithaca faith communities, and we welcome the Ithaca community at large as we gather here in the DeWitt Sean Greenwood Park to observe the October 7th, a Day of Atonement, for the 20 years the United States war on Afghanistan and the so-called War on Terror. Today we join communities supporting the work of the new organization BanKillerDrones.org from across the country. Communities are going to different cathedrals and houses of worship, calling on our faith leaders to end their silence about U.S. endless wars and drone strikes. From Des Moines, Iowa, from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, from New Haven, Connecticut, Syracuse, New York City, includes St. Patrick's Cathedral, Brattleboro, Vermont, we have Ithaca, Portland, Oregon, and many other towns and cities that we're not even aware of yet. So we will begin now with a statement from our group, and Holly Gump will begin. Thank you.
On October 7th, 2001, the United States began a 20-year-long war against Afghanistan and initiated the so-called War on Terror. As members of the Ithaca faith communities, we are observing October 7th, 2021 as a day of atonement, a day to repent for the silence of our places of worship concerning the war crimes of our government and military in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere around the world. More than 1 million people were killed in these wars and 9 million refugees displaced from their homelands. Over 20 years of war, the U.S. has spent more than $21 trillion on militarization, surveillance, and repression. Emblematic of those war crimes is the August 29th U.S. revenge drone attack in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, 7 of whom were children. As U.S. citizens whose tax dollars paid for the MQ-9 Reaper drone that made that attack and paid for the missile it fired, we bear responsibility for this tragedy and seek to prevent its repetition. The names of the Ahmadi family victims are Zeman Ahmadi and his 3 children, Zamir, age 20, Faisal, Farzad, age 10, Ahmadi's cousin Nasser, and Esmara. The children of Ahmadi's brother Romal, Arwin, Benjamin, Hyatt, age 2, and Malika, age 3, and Somaya, age 2. Today, October 7th, 2021, we gather to call for a real end to the 20 years of terror against the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. In our view, this means a ban on weaponized drones, an end to over-the-horizon drone strikes anywhere in the world, a rejection of the military buildup and threats of war with China, and supporting dialogue instead. A call for our religious leaders to speak out clearly and urgently for peace, including the abolition of nuclear weapons and the reduction in the military budget. We urge religious leaders to share these points with their faith communities and others to share with groups in the Ithaca community at large. I'd like to introduce now Todd Sadler, member of the Ithaca Catholic Worker.
Hi, I'm Todd Sadler, the Catholic Worker. And as I speak, I'd like to invite each of us to take a stone that we will use to memorialize the people killed in the War on Terror. Each one has a year and an estimated number of how many people were killed in the War on Terror. And it's just an estimate. So We gathered here today at our local war memorial, surrounded by the names of the honored dead in the U.S. military. So these are people who fought and died in many American wars. Our eyes scan this area in vain, looking for the names or any mention of those killed by the U.S. military, who were mostly civilians in these same wars and others. So to us, as people of faith, it is self-evident that all people, all God's children are created equal, and that their lives are of value and deserve to be protected and remembered and mourned when killed by any act of war, by any party. And it's not just the wars that are labeled here and celebrated here, but all wars, including the drone war, which is ongoing and will be until we stop it. So, in atonement for the sin of omission, we come today with these photos and names and stones to bring to this place a fuller and truer memory and respect for all our beloved dead, whose lives were and are and will be destroyed by war until, with the help of our Creator, we stop it. And so we're going to call on religious leaders and our military veterans who take care of this park, our political leaders, and our media leaders, whenever they speak of war, to tell the truth, to speak of it in a way that honors the life and the death of all people harmed by war. I'm going to invite you to each take your stone and place it here in front of this monument in memory of all the people killed by U.S. wars.
We call on our faith leaders in front of the Episcopal Church to speak out against U.S. wars and drone strikes. And we have a refrain: silence in the face of evil is evil itself. The Creator will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So a few footnotes on the U.S. military and U.S. wars. The U.S. military is the biggest cause of climate crisis, being the #1 user of carbon in the world for its 800 bases, emitting more CO2 than many countries over decades, causing massive climate disruption, desertification, superstorms, sea level rise, and mass extinction of species. This, in turn, causes massive migration of millions of refugees looking to find shelter, food, job, and safety. The U.S. wars in Afghanistan alone caused 9 million refugees and internally displaced peoples. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. U.S. drone strikes have killed over 6,000 people in Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and elsewhere. U.S. military generals admit that for every 1 drone victim, 10 more people look at the U.S. as the terrorist. The drone papers revealed by whistleblower Daniel Hale reveals that 90% of victims are bystanders, unintended victims, such as the Ahmadi family whose photos we hold here today. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself.
The Episcopal Church of Ithaca has endorsed the Back from the Brink, which is the treaty to abolish nuclear weapons in the world.
So some of our faith leaders have spoken out, And Mother Megan Castellan is one of our key leaders in that sense. So we thank her and this community. All right. U.S. militaries gave leftover equipment to U.S. city police departments, like we saw used on the streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and in Ferguson to be used on people of color and to the police at border communities. Police departments have many retired military personnel in their ranks, repeating tactics used in their trainings for war, treating U.S. civilians as if they were enemy combatants. The U.S. military budget uses almost 60% of our total government expenditures, which steals from the needs of our communities, especially from people of color and indigenous peoples who are left without basic human needs like jobs, housing, and health care. Veterans and drone pilots have some of the highest suicide rates in the country and some of the worst medical care, being prescribed pills to mask their deep pain and moral injury. Eleanor Levine of Code Pink from San Francisco wrote a short piece. She says, over 20 years, the U.S. has spent more than $21 trillion on militarization, surveillance, and repression, all in the name of security. These investments have shown us that the U.S. has the capacity and political will to invest in our biggest priorities. But the COVID-19 pandemic, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, wildfires raging in the West, superstorms in the South and on the East Coast, and even the fall of Afghanistan have shown us that these investments cannot buy us safety. The next 20 years present an opportunity to reconsider where we need to reinvest in a better future.
My name is Neil Golder. This is a statement from Dan Berrigan at the Catonsville, Maryland Draft Board action during the Vietnam War. The time is past when good people can remain silent, when obedience can segregate people from public risk, when the poor can die without defense. We ask our fellow people of faith and conscience to consider in their hearts a question which has tortured us night and day since the war began. How many must die before our voices are heard? How many must be tortured, dislocated, starved, maddened? How long must the world's resources be raped in the service of legalized murder? When, at what point, will you say no to this war? We have chosen to say, with the gift of our liberty, if necessary, our lives, the violence stops here. The death stops here. The suppression of the truth stops here. This war stops here.
My name is Beth Harris. I think it's important for us to think beyond the drone strikes in Afghanistan in terms of endless wars right now. In particular, how the war on terror is continuing the attack on Palestinians since 1948, where their existence has become outlawed and they have not received the protections of basic human rights law. Just recently, an extra $1 billion was sent to Israel to replace its Iron Dome, when the people who were killed with the invasion of Gaza were almost all Palestinians whose lives need to be protected here. And I also wanted to say in our own hemisphere, since 1804, the U.S. has been conducting a war on Haiti. There's been a constant revenge for Haiti having the audacity to end slavery in 1804 and to rule themselves. And so I think the call that is being made today is so important, but I think we need to broaden it in terms of the space that this, what I would say is the war of terror across the world, including here in the Americas.
My name is Claire Grady. I am one of the actors with the Kings Bay Plowshares. I come here as a human being and a world citizen, but particularly a United States citizen and particularly a Catholic woman. I am very sad that my church is not more clear about killing in war. And I want to read a statement we recently wrote as the Kings Bay Plowshares about nuclear weapons. Current world events reveal the nuclear threat to the planet to be growing ever larger. We applaud Archbishop Gallagher, Vatican Secretary for Relations with the States, in his recent address to the United Nations General Assembly high-level plenary session, commemorating and promoting the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons on September 26th. Archbishop Gallagher noted that the global observance of this day is, quote, an occasion to impress on the world, and particularly the leaders of nuclear weapon states, humanity's insistent demand for the elimination of nuclear weapons. He pointed out that nuclear deterrence is a fallacy, and that the money spent on these weapons is desperately needed for social betterment and the elimination of hunger. We in the Kings Bay Plowshares sound the alarm that the U.S. nuclear policy continues to move in the opposite direction from disarmament. Our government spends $100,000 per minute in upgrading our nuclear arsenal. With the new trilateral military partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, AUKUS, the U.S. has agreed to help Australia build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. China has denounced the deal, saying the countries are, quote, severely damaging regional peace and stability, intensifying an arms race, and damaging international nuclear non-proliferation efforts. We call on fellow U.S. Catholics to join the global efforts for nuclear disarmament by encouraging our country to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and by divesting from nuclear weapons. Since the 4th century, Christians have used St. Augustine's just war criteria as a means to legitimize war as morally acceptable. The modern introduction of indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction to warfare has rendered all war-making morally untenable. In fact, the prospect of the use of indiscriminate weapons violates all elements of the just war criteria, especially the condition that calls for the protection of non-combatants, which is impossible in today's world in which the human experiment itself is under threat of nuclear doom. I would add drone warfare, all of those very seductive and enticing forms of warfare that we think are more humane are killing civilians. We need to tell the truth about that. And I explicitly read the part from the Vatican, and I could spend hours reading church teaching on war and peace. But it would be hard to find that studied and acted on from my church. So I come here today repentant, observing this Day of Atonement, as my country, with my money, my blessing, has waged war for 20 years in Afghanistan. And that's not even mentioning all of the places like Palestine, in Africa, and here on Turtle Island. So as we stand on this land here, this Cayuga land. I want to say I was with Onondaga woman this past weekend, and a Blackfoot man who both testified to their experience of the boarding schools. And that's just one tiny slice of what they were sharing, of what the experience of my church's relationship with indigenous people here on Turtle Island. So I think there's a lot to atone for. And at this time of year, I know there's a lot to atone for. If we're not actively seeking that, making amends and seeking that reconciliation, then our words are hollow. This time of year in the Catholic lectionary, we always read from the book of Jonah. And that book is very short, but it's full of lessons about atonement and about mercy and about how human beings reserve the right for judgment and vengeance and violence, continued violence, basically, ultimately being so angry we could die ourselves. But that God is loving and compassionate, slow to anger and merciful. May we take God's heed and bring the light of that good news to our communities, in the churches and beyond, so that we can bring a world to peace with justice. Thank you.
So that concludes our gathering today, and we invite people to go to their churches, go to their communities, go to places with people of conscience, invite others to join us. Thanks for being with us today. Bye-bye.